Sarah Miller sat in the back corner of the lecture hall, her tablet glowing softly in front of her. The massive room buzzed with the sounds of 40 different species settling into their seats. Clicks, hums, whistles, and the occasional growl mixed with the standard translated speech that filled Zenith Academy's corridors every day. She had learned to make herself small here. Not physically, of course. At 5'7" she was average for a human. But in a room filled with beings who considered themselves the peak of galactic civilization, being small meant being quiet. It meant not drawing attention. It meant surviving another day of casual contempt disguised as education. Professor Dirakesh strode to the front of the class, his chitinous legs clicking against the polished floor. The Krithian stood nearly 8 feet tall, his forearms gesturing dramatically as he began his lecture. His mandibles clacked together in what his species considered a warm greeting. To Sarah it always sounded faintly threatening. "Welcome, students, to Advanced Galactic Civilizations," he announced. "Today we continue our examination of developmental hierarchies among spacefaring species." Sarah's fingers moved across her tablet, taking notes. She had learned to document everything. Every slight. Every dismissal. Every moment where human achievements were erased or attributed to other species. Not because she planned to do anything with the information, but because writing it down made it feel less suffocating. "Let us review the markers of true civilization," Dirakesh continued. His upper right arm pointed to a holographic display that materialized above his head. First, technological mastery. The ability to traverse the stars not through borrowed science, but through indigenous innovation. Images of various alien spacecraft filled the air. VRYNN crystal ships that moved through dimensions humans barely understood. Keltharian vessels that could fold space itself. Mordish warships that had conquered entire sectors. No human ships appeared in the display. Second, cultural depth. Philosophy, art, governance structures that have stood the test of millennia. More images. Ancient texts. Monuments on worlds Sarah would never visit. Treaties signed before Earth had developed written language. And third, Dirakesh's voice took on a particular tone that Sarah recognized immediately: longevity. True civilization is measured not in centuries but in epochs. Sustained presence among the stars. Contributions that shape the galaxy across thousands, even tens of thousands of cycles. He paused, letting his words settle over the class. Then his 4 eyes swiveled toward the back rows where the human students sat. "Which brings us to our youngest members of galactic society. Here it comes," Sarah thought. "Humanity joined us 247 cycles ago. In the grand timeline of civilized space they arrived mere moments ago. They are, to be frank, children playing in a universe built by their elders." Laughter rippled through the front rows. Not cruel laughter exactly. More like the indulgent chuckling of adults watching a toddler try to explain quantum physics. Somehow that made it worse. Lex, a Salturian whose purple skin seemed to glow with self-satisfaction, raised one of his 3 hands. "Professor, is it even fair to call them a civilization? They haven't contributed a single original technology. Everything they used they learned from us." Now, Dirakesh's mandibles quirked upward. "They have made contributions. Why, their adaptive medical technology shows real promise. Of course, it's based entirely on VRWNN healing principles, but the application to their own biology shows a certain cleverness." More laughter. Kvara, a Mordish in the 3rd row, turned to look directly at Sarah. Her 3 eyes blinked in sequence, a gesture that her species used to express pity. "I almost feel sorry for them. Imagine being so far behind that you don't even realize how primitive you are." Sarah's grip tightened on her stylus. 2 years. 2 years of this endless condescension. 2 years of watching human history get rewritten in real time, their achievements dismissed, their presence tolerated only because the Galactic Council had decided diversity looked good in their promotional materials. "Miss Miller," Dirakesh's voice cut through her thoughts. "You've been unusually quiet today. Surely you must have thoughts on humanity's place in galactic civilization?" Every eye in the room turned toward her. Sarah could feel the weight of their attention, could sense the barely suppressed amusement waiting for whatever she might say. They wanted her to defend humanity. To make passionate arguments they could then dismantle with condescending patience. It was a game they played and she always lost. She stood slowly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Humanity has contributed. Copies of our technology?" Lex interrupted, his translator rendering his voice with an edge of mockery. "Translations of our philosophy? Pale imitations of our art. We've developed new applications," Sarah tried again. "Using our frameworks," Kvara added. "Built on our foundations. standing on shoulders of giants and claiming credit for the view. The laughter was louder now. Even some of the other human students had lowered their heads, embarrassed by association. Professor Drakesh raised one claw for silence. Please, let's allow Miss Miller to speak. I'm certain she has fascinating insights about humanity's unique contributions to our shared civilization. His tone made it clear he expected nothing of the sort. Something inside Sarah snapped. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It was more like a cable that had been under tension for too long finally giving way. She was tired. Tired of being polite. Tired of accepting their diminishment. Tired of pretending that their ignorance was somehow her problem to solve. You want to know about human contributions? Her voice was quiet, but it carried across the lecture hall. You want to understand what we bring to galactic civilization? She stepped into the aisle, walking forward with steady, deliberate steps. The mockery in the room hadn't quite faded, but it had shifted. Curiosity, at least, was a change from contempt. We bring memory, Sarah said. She raised her right hand, palm forward, as if making a simple gesture to emphasize her point. Her sleeve fell back. The tattoo covered her entire hand. Intricate patterns of stars and geometric shapes flowed across her skin, rendered in ink so dark it seemed to drink the light. The design continued past her wrist, disappearing up her arm beneath her uniform. At the center of her palm was a spiral pattern, ancient and unmistakable. Professor Drakesh's forearms froze mid-gesture. His mandibles stopped clicking. For the first time since Sarah had known him, the Crithian was completely, utterly still. The VRWN in the front row pulsed with sudden brilliant light, their crystalline bodies reacting to shock in the only way their species could express it. Kvara rose halfway from her seat, her three eyes widening until Sarah could see the individual patterns in her irises. Lex's purple skin faded to pale lavender. The silence that filled the lecture hall was absolute. Not the silence before mockery. Not the pause before laughter. This was the silence of recognition. Of impossible understanding. Of seeing something that should not exist. That mark? Kvara's voice was barely a whisper, her translator struggling to render her shock. That's the sign of the walkers. Professor Drakesh descended from his platform. His movements were careful now, almost reverent. He approached Sarah slowly, his eyes fixed on her hand as if she were holding a relic from a museum instead of simply standing in his classroom. Where did you acquire that symbol? His voice had lost every trace of condescension. Now there was only careful, cautious respect. Who gave you permission to wear it? Sarah held her hand steady, letting them all see it clearly. The star map at its center showed constellations that hadn't existed in current galactic charts for 50,000 years. The symbols surrounding it were written in languages that predated modern civilization. No one gave me permission, Professor, she said quietly. I earned it. The lecture hall remained frozen in stunned silence. Sarah stood in the aisle, her marked hand still raised, watching as the galaxy's so-called superior species struggled to process what they were seeing. Professor Drakesh circled her slowly, his four eyes examining the tattoo from every angle as if it might disappear if he looked away. Impossible, he muttered. The walkers vanished before the first collapse. There are no descendants. No survivors. They're mentioned in fragments of ancient texts, nothing more. Historical ghosts. Not ghosts, Sarah said calmly. Just quiet. Kvara had fully risen from her seat now, her three eyes locked on the spiral pattern at the center of Sarah's palm. The walkers were the first civilization to achieve faster-than-light travel. They mapped the galaxy when most of our species were still evolving in tidal pools. They built the foundation stations. They established the principles of the Galactic Council. They were ancient beyond measure, a VRWN student finished, her crystalline form pulsing with rapid, anxious light. My people's oldest records mention them. They taught us stellar navigation. They showed us how to move between dimensions. And then they disappeared. 50,000 cycles ago, they simply vanished from known space. Sarah lowered her hand but kept it visible, the tattoo catching the lecture hall's shifting lights. We didn't vanish. We went home. Home? Lex's purple skin had regained some of its color, but his voice still trembled. You're saying humans are descended from the walkers? That's absurd. Humans are barely civilized. You couldn't even achieve orbital flight until 300 cycles ago. Exactly, Sarah said. She walked to the front of the class, standing beside Professor Drakesh's holographic display. With a gesture, she dismissed his images and pulled up her own files from her tablet. A star map appeared, but it looked nothing like the current galactic charts. This is what the galaxy looked like 53,000 cycles ago. The map showed empires that no longer existed, species that had gone extinct, stations and waypoints in places that were now empty space. And moving through it all were the paths of the walker ships, connecting everything, teaching everyone, building the foundations of civilization. The walkers spent 20,000 cycles exploring the galaxy, Sarah continued. They met hundreds of species, shared knowledge, helped young civilizations reach the stars. They were teachers, guides, explorers. They built the first universal translator. They created the mathematical principles that make faster-than-light travel possible. They established the laws that govern peaceful contact between species. She changed the image. Now it showed a timeline, marked with events that predated every civilization currently in the room. But they also watched civilizations rise and fall. They saw empires that lasted 10,000 cycles collapse in a generation. They witnessed species destroy themselves with their own technology. They watched as the things they built were used for war, for conquest, for greed. Professor Drakesh's mandibles clicked softly. The Great Collapse. Our records speak of it. A period of galactic-wide conflict that nearly destroyed all spacefaring civilization. But the details are lost to history. Not lost, Sarah said. Remembered. The walkers saw it coming. They tried to prevent it. But the younger species wouldn't listen. They thought they knew better. They thought their technology made them invincible. The war lasted 800 cycles and reduced the galaxy's population by 90%. The room was silent except for Sarah's voice and the soft hum of the holographic display. Even the translator system seemed to be working more quietly, as if afraid to interrupt. When it was over, the walkers made a choice. Sarah pulled up another image. This one showed Earth, blue and green and impossibly primitive compared to the space stations and megastructures around it. They had a homeworld. A place they'd left behind when they first reached the stars. It was still there, still viable, still untouched by the wars that had consumed the galaxy. They went backwards? Kvara sounded genuinely confused. They gave up technology? Space travel? Everything they'd built? They didn't give it up, Sarah corrected. They preserved it differently. They realized that written records could be destroyed. Digital archives could be corrupted. Physical monuments could be demolished. But memory carried in living minds passed from generation to generation, protected and preserved, that was harder to kill. She touched her tattoo, tracing the spiral pattern with her other hand. So they went home. They disbanded their fleets. They dismantled their stations. They erased themselves from the galaxy's active civilizations. And they became keepers instead of travelers. Watchers instead of guides. For 50,000 years? Lex shook his head. No civilization could maintain continuity for that long. Languages change. Cultures evolve. Knowledge gets lost. Not if you make it sacred, Sarah said quietly. Not if you turn remembering into the highest duty. The walkers became a tribe of memory keepers. We lived simple lives on our homeworld. We didn't build cities of steel or ships that could cross the galaxy. We built something harder to destroy. We built tradition. She pulled up an image of her mother, standing in a simple room with earthen walls. The woman's hands bore the same tattoos as Sarah's, though the patterns were different in the details. Every keeper memorizes the histories, the star maps, the warnings, the mistakes of past civilizations. We learn them as children. We recite them as adults. And when we prove we can carry the knowledge perfectly, we earn the mark. Professor Drakesh leaned closer, examining the tattoo with new understanding. The patterns. They're not decorative. They're mnemonic devices. Each symbol triggers a memory, Sarah confirmed. This spiral represents the Great Collapse. These stars mark the locations of the foundation stations. These geometric shapes encode the mathematical principles of dimensional travel. This line of text warns about the void engines and why they should never be rebuilt. She turned her hand, showing different angles. My mother taught me for 20 years. Every day we would recite the histories. Every night we would trace the star maps. When I could reproduce every detail from memory, when I could explain the meaning behind every symbol, when I proved I would carry the knowledge forward. Then she gave me the mark. But why? A VRNN student asked. Why hide for so long? Why let the galaxy forget you? Because the galaxy needed to learn on its own, Sarah said. The walkers tried to guide and species became dependent. They tried to teach and species stopped thinking for themselves. They tried to prevent mistakes and species never learned from consequences. So they stepped back. They watched. They remembered. And they waited. Waited for what? Var asked. Sarah smiled slightly. For the younger species to become wise enough to listen. For civilizations to mature past their arrogant phase. For the day when the old knowledge would be needed again. She looked around the lecture hall, meeting the eyes of students who had mocked her just minutes ago. The walkers knew that everything moves in cycles. Civilizations rise. Civilizations fall. Technologies are discovered, lost, and rediscovered. Mistakes are made over and over until finally, someone remembers why they're mistakes. She closed the holographic display. So yes, humanity is new to galactic society. We've only been here 247 cycles. But we're not newcomers to the stars. We're the descendants of the first travelers. We chose to forget how to build ships because we needed to remember why we built them in the first place. Professor Drakesh stood motionless for a long moment. Then, slowly, he lowered his body in the Krithian gesture of respect usually reserved for elders and masters. I have been teaching galactic history for 300 cycles, he said quietly. And I have learned more in the last 10 minutes than in my entire career. The Academy Council chambers looked nothing like the lecture hall. This room was circular, with seats arranged in ascending tiers that created an amphitheater effect. Representatives from 12 major galactic civilizations sat in those seats, their various forms creating a tapestry of the galaxy's diversity. At the center, alone under a spotlight, stood Sarah Miller. 24 hours had passed since her revelation in Professor Drakesh's class. 24 hours of whispered conversations, emergency meetings, and frantic research as the Academy scholars tried to verify her claims. Now the council had assembled to test her knowledge themselves. Chancellor Mordrin presided over the gathering. The ancient being species was unknown to most current civilizations. He claimed to be over 8,000 cycles old, though no one could verify it. His form was vaguely humanoid, covered in what looked like living bark, with eyes that glowed a soft amber. Miss Miller, his voice was like wine through autumn leaves, you have made extraordinary claims. The Council of Zenith Academy takes such matters seriously. We cannot simply accept that humanity descends from the walkers based on a tattoo, no matter how authentic it appears. I understand, Sarah said calmly. Therefore we will test your knowledge. Mordrin gestured to the assembled council. These are some of the finest historical scholars in known space. They will ask you questions about the ancient galaxy. Questions whose answers exist only in fragments if they exist at all. If you truly carry the memories of the walkers, you will be able to answer them. A Vierwanen scholar leaned forward, her crystalline form refracting the chamber's light into rainbow patterns. The foundation stations. Our records mention 7 built by the walkers, but we've only found ruins of 3. Where are the others? Sarah didn't hesitate. There were 9, not 7. Your records are incomplete. She held up her hand, pointing to specific marks on her tattoo. Station 1 is in the Kelver sector, but you call it something else now. The Keltharians built their capital over its ruins and renamed it New Kelth. Station 2 is in what you call the Dead Zone, still functional but buried under 3,000 cycles of asteroid impacts. Station 3 you found. Station 4 was destroyed in the Great Collapse. Station 5. She continued, listing each station's location with precise coordinates. The Vierwanen scholar's glow intensified with each answer, her species' version of shocked excitement. A Keltharian raised 3 of his 6 arms. The Treaty of 7 Suns. Our oldest records mention it but provide no details. What was it? It wasn't a treaty, Sarah corrected gently. It was a warning. 7 star systems entered gravitational resonance, creating a cascade effect that would have destroyed 40 inhabited worlds. The walkers helped the local species evacuate. The treaty you mention was actually an agreement about who would settle which refugee populations where. She traced another section of her tattoo. The evacuation took 12 cycles. 2 billion beings were relocated. The walkers provided the ships and navigation, but they made each species responsible for their own people. They wanted you to learn cooperation, not dependence. Professor Drakesh, sitting in the lower tier, clicked his mandibles thoughtfully. The void engines. You mentioned them earlier. Our archaeological teams found references to them in ruins on Kelmar 7, but the text was too damaged to read. What were they? Sarah's expression darkened. Something that should stay forgotten. She paused, then continued. But you asked, so I'll tell you. The void engines were faster-than-light drives that worked by creating small tears in the fabric of space. They were incredibly efficient. A ship with void engines could cross the galaxy in days instead of weeks. That sounds remarkable, Kvara said from her seat. Why aren't we using them? Because the tiers didn't close, Sarah said quietly. Each jump left a small wound in space. Individually they were harmless. But after 20,000 cycles of use, the galaxy had millions of these tears. They started connecting, merging, growing. The void rifts began consuming entire star systems. She held up her hand, showing a cluster of symbols near her wrist. It took 3,000 cycles to seal the rifts. Dozens of species went extinct. Hundreds of worlds became uninhabitable. The walkers helped create the sealing technology, but the damage was immense. That's why this symbol exists on every keeper's hand. So we never forget what happens when we use technology without understanding its long-term consequences. The chamber fell silent. Several council members were frantically checking their databases, trying to verify her claims against archaeological records. Chancellor Mordrin spoke again. The first collapse. You mentioned it cost 90% of the galaxy's population. Our records suggest a major conflict occurred approximately 50,000 cycles ago, but the details are unclear. Tell us what happened. Sarah took a breath. This was the hard part. The part that every keeper learned with tears and grief, because the memories were designed to hurt. Pain made them unforgettable. It started with resource competition, she began. 3 major empires wanted control of the Archon cluster, a region rich in rare elements. The walkers tried to mediate. They proposed sharing agreements, trade pacts, joint governance. But the empires refused. They said they were strong enough to take what they wanted. She walked in a small circle, her eyes distant as she recited memories 50,000 years old. The war began in cycle 47,293 of the Walker calendar. It was supposed to be quick, decisive. One empire would win, the others would submit, and life would continue. But each empire had allies. And those allies had allies. Within 10 cycles, 60% of known civilizations were involved. Weapons became more desperate. Planet killers. Star snuffers. Bioweapons that could sterilize entire worlds. The dimensional bombs. She stopped walking, her voice dropping. Those were the worst. They didn't just destroy matter. They erased it from ever having existed. Entire species removed from the timeline. Billions of beings who never were, never had been, never could be. A Mordesh scholar stood abruptly. That's impossible. Our physics doesn't allow for temporal erasure. Your current physics doesn't, Sarah agreed. The walkers made sure that knowledge was lost. Some technologies are too dangerous to exist. But yes, it happened. 17 species were erased from history. The only reason we remember them is because the walkers were outside the affected timelines when the bombs were used. She touched her tattoo again, showing a section covered in names written in a script none of them could read. These are their names. The erased peoples. We remember them because no one else can. We speak their names in our ceremonies because they have no other voices left. Chancellor Mordrin's amber eyes dimmed slightly. How did it end? Exhaustion, Sarah said simply. After 800 cycles, there was nothing left to fight with and no one left to fight. The surviving populations were scattered, broken, barely able to maintain basic technology. The walkers spent the next 2,000 cycles helping rebuild. Teaching basic agriculture. Showing how to purify water. Helping species relearn what they'd forgotten in their rush to destroy each other. She looked around the chamber. That's when they made their decision. They realized they'd become enablers. By giving knowledge freely, they'd created civilizations that never struggled, never learned restraint, never developed wisdom alongside power. So they left. They went home. And they became keepers instead of teachers. A young Salturian student in the observation gallery raised a tentacle. But why come back now? Why reveal yourselves after 50,000 years? Sarah met the student's eyes. Because you're making the same mistakes. Different names, different technologies, but the same patterns. Competition over resources. Empires growing ambitious. Species developing weapons faster than wisdom. The cycle is beginning again. She held up her marked hand one more time. The walker sent us back to remind you. Not to save you. You have to save yourselves. But to remember for you so you know what's coming if you don't change course. Chancellor Mordrin stood slowly, his ancient form moving with the weight of his years. The council will need time to verify these claims, but... He paused, looking at Sarah with something like wonder. I am 8,000 cycles old. I have studied history my entire life. And nothing in my education matches the clarity, the detail, the coherence of what you've just shared. He bowed his head slightly. Perhaps humanity is not as young as we believed. The alarms began screaming 3 days after Sarah's testimony before the council. She was in her dormitory, reviewing ancient star charts with a small group of students who had suddenly become very interested in human history, when the emergency lighting flooded the corridors with pulsing red. All students report to shelter stations immediately, the automated system announced in 12 languages simultaneously. This is not a drill. Spatial anomaly detected. Repeat, this is not a drill. Sarah's blood went cold. She knew that term. Spatial anomaly. It was the modern scientific way of saying something that the walkers had a much older, much more specific name for. She ran toward the observation deck instead of the shelters, ignoring the protests of students flowing in the opposite direction. Her feet pounded against the metal floors as warning klaxons blared overhead. She had to see it. Had to confirm what she feared. The observation deck was empty except for 2 security officers who tried to stop her. "Miss Miller, you need to get to safety." "Let me see," she demanded, pushing past them to the massive transparent wall that looked out into space. At first she saw nothing unusual. Stars glittered in the endless dark. The Academy's position in neutral space meant they were far from any major systems, surrounded by the peaceful emptiness between territories. Then she saw it. A tear in space itself. It looked like reality had been cut with an invisible knife, the edges shimmering with colors that shouldn't exist. Through the tear she could see something that made her eyes hurt. Not darkness but the absence of existence itself. The void. "No," Sarah whispered. "Not here. Not now." One of the security officers was speaking frantically into his communicator. "Chancellor, the anomaly is expanding. Current growth rate suggests it will reach the Academy in 47 minutes. Sarah grabbed the officer's arm. "I need to speak to Chancellor Mordrin. Right now." "Miss Miller, we're in the middle of an emergency." "I know what that is." Her voice cut through his objection like a blade. "I know what it is and I know what will happen if you try to handle it the way you're thinking. Get me to the Chancellor now or everyone on this station will die." Something in her tone must have convinced him. Within minutes, Sarah was being rushed through the emergency command center, a circular room filled with holographic displays and frantic staff members coordinating the evacuation. Chancellor Mordrin stood at the center, his bark-like skin darkened with stress. "Sarah," he said, his ancient eyes meeting hers. "I assume you know what we're facing." "A void rift," she said, moving to stand beside him. "One of the tiers I told you about. From the old void engines." Professor Drakesh turned from a tactical display, his mandibles clicking rapidly. "That's impossible. According to your testimony, the rifts were sealed 50,000 cycles ago." "Most of them were," Sarah said, studying the holographic representation of the rift. "But some were too deep. Too entrenched in the fabric of space. The walkers couldn't seal them, so they stabilized them instead. Locked them in a kind of stasis. They left warning beacons around each one so future civilizations would know to avoid them. We found no warning beacons in this sector," a VRWN navigator said. 50,000 years is a long time," Sarah replied grimly. "Stars move. Beacons fail. Or someone dismantled them for parts without knowing what they were protecting." She turned to Mordrin. "What were you planning to do?" "Standard protocol for spatial anomalies," the Chancellor said. "We're preparing to fire graviton beams to collapse the rift before it grows larger." "No." Sarah's shout made everyone in the command center turn. "That's exactly what you can't do. Graviton beams will destabilize the stasis field. You'll turn a contained rift into an active one." "Then what do you suggest?" Dirakesh demanded. "We can't just let it grow. At current expansion rate, it will consume the Academy in less than an hour." Sarah closed her eyes, her hand unconsciously moving to her tattoo. She traced the symbols there, feeling the patterns under her fingers, letting them trigger the memories. 50,000 years of knowledge, passed down through generations of keepers. Somewhere in that vast library of human memory was the answer. "The resonance lock," she said suddenly, her eyes snapping open. "The walkers used harmonic frequencies to reinforce the stasis fields around unstable rifts. If we can match the original frequency, we can restore the lock and stop the expansion." "We don't have harmonic generators powerful enough for spatial manipulation," a Keltharian engineer said, his 6 arms moving frantically across multiple control panels. "You don't need them," Sarah said. She pulled up a new display, her fingers moving rapidly as she recreated diagrams from memory. "The Academy's communication array. It's designed to broadcast across multiple frequencies simultaneously for universal translation. We can recalibrate it to produce the harmonic frequency we need." "You know the exact frequency required?" Mordrin asked. Sarah held up her hand, showing a series of geometric patterns on her tattoo. Every keeper memorizes the rift harmonics. There are 17 different frequencies, one for each type of void tear. This rift. She studied the readings, comparing them to the knowledge in her memory, is a Type 7. Mid-depth, probably formed from a commercial shipping lane where void engines were used heavily. She began rattling off numbers. Frequencies measured in wavelengths that modern science barely recognized. The engineers stared at her, then started frantically inputting the data she provided. "This is insane," one of them muttered. "We're trusting our lives to ancient memories and a tattoo. You have a better option?" Sarah challenged. "Your graviton beams will kill us. Evacuation ships can't outrun a growing rift. And doing nothing guarantees we all die when it reaches the station." She pointed at her calculations on the screen. "This is the only chance." Chancellor Mordrin studied the data for a long moment, then nodded. "Do it. Recalibrate the communications array to broadcast Miss Miller's frequencies." The next 20 minutes were chaos. Engineers worked frantically to convert a communication system into a spatial harmonic generator. Sarah stood over them, correcting errors, adjusting frequencies, drawing on knowledge that predated their entire civilizations. The rift continued to grow, its edges now visible from the command center windows without magnification. 15 minutes until the rift reaches us, someone called out. "Array recalibration at 70%, an engineer responded. Sarah watched the numbers scroll across the displays, her heart pounding. This had to work. The walkers had sealed hundreds of rifts using this method. The knowledge was good. But she was working with people who didn't understand the underlying principles, using equipment that wasn't designed for this purpose and running out of time. "Array ready," the chief engineer announced. "On your command, Chancellor." Mordrin looked at Sarah. "Any final adjustments?" She checked the frequencies one more time, comparing them to the patterns etched in her skin and burned into her memory. The harmonic needs to pulse in a specific rhythm. 3-second bursts, 2-second pauses. The stasis field responds to the rhythm as much as the frequency. "Configure it," Mordrin ordered. 5 minutes to contact. The warning came. "Activating array now." The deck hummed beneath their feet as the massive communications array redirected all its power into a single focused harmonic beam. The frequency was inaudible to most species present, but Sarah could feel it in her bones. It matched the rhythm her mother had made her practice as a child, tapping out the patterns on her palm while reciting the rift harmonics. For a moment nothing happened. The rift continued to expand, its edges reaching toward the academy like grasping fingers of unreality. Then it stopped. The shimmer at the rift's edges stabilized. The impossible colors began to fade, replaced by the normal black of space. The tear began to shrink, slowly at first, then faster. "It's working," someone breathed. Sarah watched the readings, her hands clenched. The rift was collapsing back to its original size, the stasis field reforming around it. Within minutes, it had reduced to a barely visible point in space, no larger than a fist, contained and stable once more. The command center erupted in cheers. Engineers hugged each other. Even the normally stoic VRWN were pulsing with relieved light. Chancellor Mordrin approached Sarah, his ancient eyes studying her with new respect. "You saved us. Knowledge from 50,000 years ago, preserved in human memory, saved this academy." Sarah looked down at her tattoo, at the symbols that had seemed so primitive to her classmates just days ago. The walkers knew this would happen eventually. That's why they made us remember. Because the galaxy forgets too easily, and some lessons cost too much to learn twice. The Galactic Council chamber on Zenith Academy had never been so full. Representatives from 47 civilizations crowded into a space designed for 20. They stood in the aisles, floated near the ceiling, clustered in corners. Everyone wanted to witness what was about to happen. Sarah Miller stood at the center of the chamber once again, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. No spotlight isolated her. No hostile questions waited. Instead, she was surrounded by scholars, diplomats, and leaders who looked at her with something humanity had never received from the galactic community before. Respect. Chancellor Mordrin rose from his seat, and the chamber fell silent. 10 days ago, a human student revealed knowledge that saved this academy and everyone aboard it. Knowledge preserved for 50,000 cycles through nothing more than human memory and tradition. Today, the Galactic Council has gathered to address the implications of this revelation. He gestured to a holographic display that materialized above the assembly. It showed the void rift, now safely contained, along with the harmonic frequency Sarah had provided. Our best scientists have spent the past week analyzing what occurred. They have confirmed that Miss Miller's knowledge is accurate in every detail. The frequencies she provided match theoretical models we've only recently developed. The containment method she described is more elegant than anything our current technology could have devised. A VR when an elder floated forward, her crystalline form catching the light. We have also investigated her other claims. Using the coordinates she provided, we sent survey teams to 3 locations she identified as foundation stations. All 3 contain ruins matching Walker architecture. We found fragments of technology that predate our oldest artifacts by tens of thousands of cycles. Professor Diarikesh stood next, his 4 arms folded in a gesture of humility that Sarah had never seen from him before. I owe Miss Miller an apology. I called humanity primitive. I dismissed their contributions as derivative. I measured their worth by the standards of technological advancement alone. I was wrong. He clicked his mandibles slowly. True civilization is not measured in ships or stations. It is measured in wisdom. In the ability to learn from the past. In the discipline to preserve important knowledge across unimaginable spans of time. By these standards, humanity may be the most advanced civilization in this chamber. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. Sarah noticed Lex in the crowd, his purple skin flushed darker with what she recognized as Salturian embarrassment. Kvara sat nearby, all 3 of her eyes fixed on Sarah with what looked like genuine admiration. Chancellor Mordrin continued. The Council has made several decisions. First, we are establishing the Walker Archive here at Zenith Academy. It will be dedicated to recovering and preserving the ancient knowledge that humanity has protected. Miss Miller has agreed to serve as its first director. Sarah nodded. She had expected this. The Keepers had always known that eventually, they would need to share what they had preserved. The galaxy was ready to listen now. Second, Mordrin said, we are sending expeditions to locate and secure all remaining void rifts. Miss Miller has provided coordinates for 47 additional sites. Each one will be properly marked and monitored to prevent future incidents. He paused, his amber eyes sweeping the chamber. But the most important decision concerns humanity's status in galactic civilization. For too long we have treated them as newcomers. As children playing in a universe built by others. This was arrogance born of ignorance. The holographic display changed, now showing Earth. The blue and green planet rotated slowly, looking peaceful and unremarkable. Just another world among billions. Humanity chose to return to their homeworld 50,000 cycles ago, Mordrin continued. They chose to live simply. To preserve knowledge rather than build empires. They watched as civilizations rose and fell, as species made the same mistakes repeatedly, as the lessons of the past were forgotten again and again. And they waited. They remembered. They kept the stories alive so that when the time came when we were ready to listen, they could teach us what we had forgotten. He turned to face Sarah directly. The Galactic Council formally recognizes humanity not as a new species, but as the keepers of deep time. You carry memories that predate all of us. You preserve wisdom we desperately need. And you have earned your place among us not through military might or technological superiority, but through something far more valuable. You remember when the rest of us forget. The chamber erupted in a sound that took Sarah a moment to recognize. It was applause, translated across dozens of species into their equivalents. Clicks, hums, light pulses, and vibrations all expressing the same thing. Approval. Celebration. Welcome. Sarah felt something warm in her chest. Not pride exactly. More like relief. The burden her people had carried for 50,000 years felt lighter somehow, now that it was shared. A young Keltharian student raised several arms hesitantly. Miss Miller, may I ask a question? Of course, Sarah said. Are there other humans like you? Other keepers? Sarah smiled. Thousands of us. We live quiet lives on Earth, mostly in small communities. We don't seek attention or glory. We simply pass the knowledge from generation to generation. My cousin is learning the star maps now. My neighbor's daughter is memorizing the war histories. An old man in my village can recite the names of every species that existed before the Great Collapse. Will they come here? Another student asked. Will they teach us? Some will, Sarah confirmed. But most will stay on Earth. The Keeper's primary duty is to preserve, not to teach. We share knowledge when it's needed, when the galaxy is ready to receive it. But we don't force it on anyone. You have to want to learn. You have to be willing to admit that maybe you don't know everything. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of beings from dozens of worlds. For 50,000 years you forgot us. You forgot the walkers, forgot the Foundation stations, forgot the mistakes that nearly destroyed the galaxy. You rediscovered space travel, rebuilt civilizations, developed new technologies. And you started making the same mistakes all over again. Her voice was gentle but firm. The void rift wasn't an accident. It was a warning. The galaxy is heading toward another collapse. Different details, same pattern. Competition over resources. Empires growing hungry. Species developing weapons they don't understand. The cycle repeating. Chancellor Mordrin nodded slowly. And you have returned to warn us. To remind you, Sarah corrected. We can't save you. The walkers learned that lesson. Species have to save themselves. But we can remember for you. We can show you what happened before. We can help you recognize the patterns before it's too late. She held up her hand, showing the tattoo that had started everything. This mark isn't just history. It's a map forward. Every symbol, every pattern, every story preserved in human memory is a lesson about what works and what fails. What builds and what destroys. What creates lasting civilization and what leads to collapse. Professor Drakesh approached her, moving with careful respect. Will you teach us? Will you share these lessons? I will, Sarah said. But understand what you're asking. The lessons aren't comfortable. They require admitting that your ancestors made terrible mistakes. They require accepting that maybe your current path leads to disaster. They require humility. We're ready, Drakesh said quietly. Several other voices echoed the sentiment. Sarah looked at them all, these beings who had mocked her just days ago. She saw genuine willingness in their expressions. Perhaps the galaxy really was ready this time. Then we'll begin tomorrow, she said. I'll start with the foundation principles, the basic philosophies the walkers used to build stable civilizations. After that, we'll cover the warning signs, the patterns that predict collapse. And then, if you're still willing to listen, I'll teach you about the species that vanished, the ones who didn't learn in time. Chancellor Mordrin bowed his head, and one by one, the other council members did the same. A chamber full of the galaxy's most advanced species, bowing to a human who carried nothing more impressive than memories and ink. Sarah thought of her mother back on Earth, tending her garden and teaching the next generation of keepers. She thought of the long line of humans who had preserved this knowledge through ice ages and wars, through plagues and disasters, through 50,000 years of patient waiting. They had kept the faith. They had remembered when everyone else forgot. And now, finally, the galaxy was ready to learn. She touched her tattoo one more time, feeling the patterns beneath her fingers. Each symbol was a story. Each story was a lesson. And each lesson was a gift from the past to the future. The walkers once told a saying, Sarah said to the assembled council. It has been passed down through every keeper since the beginning. The galaxy has a short memory, but humanity remembers. When the stars forget their history, we will speak it back to them. When civilizations lose their way, we will show them the paths walked before. This is our burden. This is our gift. We are the keepers of deep time. She smiled. Today we share that gift with you. May you use it wisely. The applause came again, louder this time. And Sarah Miller, once mocked as a primitive newcomer, stood tall as humanity took its rightful place among the stars. Not as conquerors. Not as warriors. Not as technological masters. But as something far more important. As the keepers who remembered when everyone else forgot.